I am thrilled to be able to present our panel today on staying up to date on the school choice literature. I'm Lindsey Burke, Director of the Center for Education Policy at the Heritage Foundation, and am joined by a fantastic group of experts to talk about various aspects of the school choice literature as we know it today. So first, I am pleased that we will hear from Mike McShane, who is Director of National Research for EdChoice. He will present polling data for us, bringing us up to speed on sentiment about education choice across the country. Then we'll hear from DeAngelis, who is Director of School Choice at the Reason Foundation and an adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute. He is also the Executive Director of the Educational Freedom Institute, and he'll talk about overall impacts of education choice. Then we'll hear from Patrick Wolf, who is Distinguished Professor of Education Policy and Endowed Chair of School Choice at the University of Arkansas. He'll give us an overview of new attainment data from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and crime reduction research. And then finally, we will hear from my colleague, Jude Schwalbach, who is the Research Associate and Project Coordinator in the Center for Education Policy at the Heritage Foundation. And Jude will cover school safety data in the private school sector and charter school sector. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Mike.
Awesome. Thanks a million, Lindsey. So I'm going to go ahead and fire up my PowerPoint presentation. Hopefully all of this is play. All right. I hope everyone is seeing a PowerPoint presentation. Yes. So as Lindsey said, I'm Mike McShane. I'm Director of National Research at EdChoice. We're based in beautiful Indianapolis, Indiana, though I'm calling all of you from sunny Kansas City, Missouri today. And I'm going to be sharing some results of ongoing research that we do at EdChoice that we call our public opinion tracker. For those of you that are interested in getting more data, today I'm really going to just be kind of sharing a little teaser of some of the stuff and some specifically school choice related things. But we have on our website at EdChoice, I think it's edchoice.morningconsultintelligence.com. We have all of our polling resources related to this project. So what is this project? Every month, we poll a nationally representative sample of Americans. And every quarter, we poll a nationally representative sample of teachers. And we're always updating this information because of the sort of episodic nature of the polling that we do. We do a mix of asking some kind of current event questions. So obviously, as you might imagine, a lot of the stuff recently has been around the coronavirus and its impacts on schooling. But we also ask some just general education policy questions and some school choice specific questions. For those that are listening here, especially those that are researchers or that might be interested in those things, on that landing page that you can see, unfortunately, it's a little bit small right now, but in the upper right-hand corner, you see a tab called Resource Downloads. And on our website, every single month, we publish not only our kind of report, which is like a set of PowerPoint slides that give all this stuff up, but we also publish all of the cross tabs. So that's polling lingo for dividing down smaller demographic groups. It's like hundreds of pages of data that I think is ripe. The researcher in me is, it's ripe for tons and tons of interesting research that could be done as a result of that. We also publish the full questionnaire and everything. So basically all of this is open to the public to check this stuff out. So I just want to, like I said, offer you a bit of a teaser today of some of the stuff that we've done, some of the things that we found, hopefully pique some interest. And you'll head and check out kind of everything that we're doing. So one of the first questions that folks are always interested in is general public opinion about school choice programs. So I'll walk through what the public thinks, at least according to our survey, about the various types of school choice that we talk about. So the first one would obviously be charter schools. And you can see across the bottom of this graph, we ask this question every month. If you're interested, the question is there in italics actually on the screen. And we have seen what you basically want to do when you're reading polls like this is you kind of combine the top two lines and the bottom two lines, because the top two lines are your two supports. The stronger support is the darker blue line, the somewhat support is the lighter blue line, and then on the bottom we have those that are strongly opposed. So as you can see, charter schools in general throughout the entire course of the pandemic and even the time before that, as long as we've been conducting the survey, more people support charter schools than oppose charter schools. But interestingly, those people who strongly support charter schools has actually been this uptick throughout the course of this year. So started down at 19%, is all the way up at 25%. Now, those who only somewhat support have gone down. So, I'm not sure exactly, because we sample a different group of people every year. So maybe some of the strong folks or the somewhat folks are becoming a bit stronger. Maybe some people are getting converted. But this at least gives you some understanding of where the nation sits when we think about charter schools. Next, we can talk about, I keep hitting my arrow key futilely. It doesn't do anything. For my later presenters, don't just keep pounding the arrow key hoping that things change. It won't. Let's talk about school vouchers, right? Again, general is pretty positive on school vouchers. The folks that are supportive of it vastly outnumber those that oppose it. And again, in the same kind of fashion, one of the things that we've seen is this roughly kind of 5-point uptick of people who are strongly supporting school vouchers throughout the course of this year. Again, a corresponding 5-point dip in those that somewhat support. And if you look, the bottom, the people who are opposed, are basically unchanged throughout the entire year. Maybe there's a little dip there in March as the world went to hell in a handbasket. Maybe folks said, maybe this voucher thing, might be interested in it. But that notwithstanding, this is basically the trend throughout the course of this year. And then finally, we'll talk about education savings accounts. Again, education savings accounts, I think a lot of people, maybe because they've heard charter schools or they've heard school vouchers, have a kind of underlying assumption that they think that those are more popular than education savings accounts. Our polling consistently finds parents really like, the public in general really likes the idea of education savings accounts. So as you can see here, the negatives are tiny, right? And basically unchanging. A very, very small percentage of the population, when given a description of what an education savings account is, doesn't like them. And again, the strong support ticking up, not quite as dramatically throughout the course of this year. I guess only about 3 points. And the somewhat is down about 4 points. But again, sort of these things are trending in the right direction. So this has been polling of the general population. I wanted to throw in a couple other things here too that just, that you might find interesting. One of the questions that we've been asking is just about homeschooling. The specific question is, how have your opinions on homeschooling changed as a result of the coronavirus? And if you look, that big old blue piece of the pie there, 36% of respondents are much more favorable to homeschooling as a result of the coronavirus, which I think is a really interesting finding. And 31% are somewhat more favorable. I wanted to see, how does that look throughout the course? That little graph on the right, that much more favorable number, if we track from the beginning of the pandemic, or that sample for March was, I think, pre-pandemic, or maybe the first month of the pandemic, if there was some overlap in there. We saw, especially over the summer, a serious increase from 25 to 43%. And, when you do enough of these surveys, you wonder, was that like a weird blip? Did something happen there? And it has ticked down a little bit, but generally speaking, that much more favorable number has been robust and has stuck that way sort of throughout the entire time that we've been doing this polling. Another thing that I thought was really interesting, in a lot of these debates we've been having, we've been polling parents about their level of comfort in sending their kids back to school. One of the things that we've consistently found, it's not shown on this slide, but just as by way of background, is that parents are pretty darn split on the idea of sending kids back to school. About half of parents respond saying that they're comfortable sending their kids back, and about half of parents respond saying that they aren't. It's like a 53-47, a 52-48, but it's roughly been down the line. Where we don't see as much sort of division is on this question of how should schools respond to the coronavirus pandemic. Should they just offer one approach? So that could be entirely virtual or entirely online or some kind of hybrid approach, or should they be offering multiple options to families? And we have seen this throughout the entire time we've been asking this question. About 2/3 of respondents say that they want to see multiple learning opportunities provided to students. this is another kind of interesting, I think sort of visually it tells us a lot. And again, as I've said, these are all taken every month. We publish something like 60 or 70 slides full of information like this. This was a very pretty one that they put together, so I felt compelled to share it with all of you. So we ask, particularly the parents, we do, to use a technical term, we oversample parents, so we make sure that there's enough of them sort of in our survey sample. But we ask them, before the pandemic started, where were your children enrolled in school, and where are your children in school now? And you can actually see these really interesting flows. So as you go from left to right, those navy blues, so like the navy blue, the big thick bar there that went from public district schools into homeschooling. You see some movement, some homeschooling folks went back to district schools, most people stayed where they were before, but this is some of this information that we're tracking. Again, it's as a result of the coronavirus where folks are moving around. So as I mentioned, we also poll teachers, and I will get to in a second what their views on various school choice issues are, but I actually want to start with this one because I think this is, as so much conversation has been taking place about remote learning and others, I just wanted to share this with folks. So we asked this question, how many of you felt prepared for online learning, right? This is, again, our nationally representative sample of teachers that we sample every quarter. And we sample enough to be able to disaggregate charter school teachers, private school teachers, and traditional public school teachers. Now, on the whole, that red bar, when we asked in March, how many of you feel prepared, the very prepared number, the highest one that they offer, 26% of teachers said that they felt prepared. And by September, right, many months later, an entire summer and others, that number had only ticked up 4 points. Only about 30% felt very prepared. And one of the things I found fascinating was that when we disaggregated those numbers, it's almost entirely explained by the traditional public school teachers. So if you look at the private and charter school teachers, we see about a 10-point bump from March to September. Again, something we hoped that we would see given all of that time in their experience. But traditional public school teachers from March to September only gained a single percentage point in the number of teachers who felt very prepared to deliver online instruction. And I think that's like a shocking and shameful number that somebody failed there. We can have a debate and discussion of who did and why and how that happened. But the fact that only 1% of traditional public school teachers felt very prepared in September than March is something that's, frankly, just not good enough. So now we'll talk about, I'll sort of close here with what teachers think about these various school choice programs, right? So charter school favorability. If you look at all teachers, again, charter schools, we do like a lot of surveys do where we'll give a description. We'll also just use the term without a description. So charter schooling is above water with teachers. So more teachers like it than don't. But what I find really interesting is if you disaggregate it, district school teachers are the least likely to like them. Interestingly, private school teachers have a stronger view of charter schools than charter school teachers do themselves, which we could maybe think about and talk about. But also, if you look at the age profile there on the right, as teachers get older, they are less likely to like charter schools. Again, we could probably tell a lot of stories with this. Maybe older teachers aren't as familiar with them, or when the charter school system was smaller, maybe didn't perform as well as it does now. But they're most popular amongst young teachers. I'm going to go ahead and show a similar graph for school vouchers. Now, interestingly, the school voucher label definitely drags things down. We don't see it as dramatically with charter schools, but we definitely see it with vouchers. Voucher appears to be a bit of a toxic word with teachers. When given the description of what it is, we see those numbers go up. But it is below more teachers oppose than support when we just use the term school vouchers. But again, we don't see as dramatic of an age profile there. And it is kind of weird that, that private school teachers, when they just hear school vouchers, are sort of less likely to like it than district school teachers are. Now, obviously, once they get the description, it flies up, but something to think about, something that might be a bit interesting there. And then finally, with education savings account, much like we saw with the general population, these things are very popular. They're popular with teachers, sort of across the spectrum. And you really don't see much of an age profile with them at all. Pretty consistently liked across the entire spectrum. Like I said, I could do this all day. We publish tons and tons of slides every month. I'll just say, if you're interested in all of this, and like I said, for the researchers that are on here that might find this of interest, heading to edchoice.morningconsultintelligence.com, or if you just search EdChoice Public Opinion Tracker, there is so much data. There are so many things that we both publish and just put out in the crosstab documents. Highly recommend everybody checking it out. And if anybody has any questions about the methodology or any of that stuff, which I sort of saved all of you from walking through exactly how we conduct these things, feel free, hit up my email, McShane@edchoice.org. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Mike. That teacher preparedness for online learning number is shocking for district school teachers, really just breathtaking.
For sure.
Thank you for presenting that data. Really, really fascinating. Next, we will hear from Corey DeAngelis.
Hey, thanks so much, Lindsey, for the introduction. Michael, good job on your presentation. I thought it was interesting how when you talk about it in terms of vouchers, it's less likely to be supported than when you talk about it in other terms. And this is one of the reasons why I have even moved away from the term school choice, because a lot of people don't even know what we mean when we say school choice. So I would like to propose to people watching this to start talking about it in terms of funding students as opposed to institutions, because that's exactly what we're talking about. And there's less confusion in the discussion when you talk about it in terms of funding students instead of systems. And we do this with a lot of other taxpayer-funded initiatives. We fund people instead of the institutions with things like Pell Grants and the GI Bill. With higher education, we do it with pre-K programs, with Head Start and other state-based pre-K programs. The funding doesn't go to a residentially assigned government-run pre-K in a lot of the cases. A lot of the cases, the funding goes to the families, and you can choose between public or private providers of the pre-K services. We do the same thing with food stamps. We don't residentially assign low-income families and force them to spend their money at government-run grocery stores. We have the money go to the families, and whether you agree with food stamps or not, I think we can all agree that the money should go to people, and they should have a choice to take that money to Walmart versus Whole Foods versus Trader Joe's. And so when we're talking about school choice, I think we can convince more people that it's a great idea when we just talk about it for what it is, to fund the people instead of the institutions. But I'm going to go beyond the moral case for school choice and the logical case for school choice. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about more of a utilitarian case for school choice based on the scientific evidence. I'm not going to go over all of it, but I'll just go over 4 different tables with you guys today, looking at student attainment as defined as high school graduation, college enrollment, or college completion. I'll go over criminal activity reduction, and I will go over civic outcomes like tolerance of others and whether you engage in the political process when you grow up. And then I'll also go over the competitive effects of private school choice on the outcomes in the traditional public schools. Why am I not focusing on test scores? Well, everybody focuses on test scores all the time. Parents care a lot more about non-test score outcomes when you survey parents about what they care about. Jude is going to talk about the safety outcomes, but that's one of the things that are at the top of the list. But parents also tend to care about the culture of their schools and other things that aren't measured by standardized test scores. So this first table is the effect of private school choice programs in the U.S. on student attainment. There are 8 studies on this. Some of them overlap as well. If you delete all of the overlapping studies from different locations, there's probably only about 5 of them, but I report all of them just because the authors change and methods could change over time as well. But the preponderance of the evidence on this topic is generally positive. I also want to point out that the studies we are most interested in are the RCTs, randomized control trials. As you can see in the 3rd column, it says method. This is similar to a medical trial where students who win the lottery are compared to the students who lose the lottery. Because if you have a large enough sample, if you compare the average differences of the 2 groups, you can be pretty confident that this is the effect of the program, just like we can with medical trials. It's how we know whether particular medicines work or not. But this evidence is mostly positive. Patrick Wolf, who's on this call, or on this presentation, will go over one of the studies in Milwaukee. But for example, he also did an RCT in DC, which found that winning a lottery to attend a private school using the voucher program in DC was associated with a 21 percentage point increase in the likelihood of graduating from high school. And what's interesting to note there is the positive effect on reading test scores was only marginally positive, and it wasn't consistent over time. So we're already seeing in one of these studies, there's disconnects between effects on test scores and effects on longer term outcomes. And Patrick Wolf and Mike McShane have both done a great review of the evidence, suggesting that a lot of the times there are these kinds of disconnects between effects on test scores and effects on longer term outcomes, which is a good argument not to regulate private school choice programs based on their standardized test score results. Another disconnect that I've seen is the Louisiana RCT, Holmes, Erickson, Mills, and Wolf, the fourth row here. They found large negative effects of the Louisiana scholarship program on math and reading test scores over time, but then no statistically significant differences in high school graduation or college enrollment. So there's a disconnect there as well to note in the literature. But let's keep going to the second outcome, character development. There have been a lot of summaries of this evidence on the effects of school choice on character outcomes or on civic outcomes, such as political participation, civic engagement, and reported tolerance. Patrick Wolf, also on this discussion, was the first one, I believe, that did the civics exam review of the evidence on this, finding in general, access to private schools and charter schools generally lead to positive civic outcomes. I did an update on this in the Journal of School Choice. Also in this book, School Choice: Separating Fact from Fiction, which is edited by Patrick J. Wolf. I did a chapter which is similar to this table that I'm presenting today. And then Patrick and I also did an updated version in Lindsey Burke's co-edited volume with Jonathan Butcher, Heritage Foundation's. The book's called Not So Great Society, where we update this evidence. But here's pretty much the takeaway here in this table in front of you. And EdChoice has also done the 1, 2, 3s of school choice, similarly finding that school choice tends to lead to better civic outcomes. And I just like to point out the disconnects in this table too. For example, look at Bettinger and Slonim. This is I think the 6th study from the top, in Ohio voucher program, randomized control trial, gold standard evaluation. I believe they found no statistically significant, at least at the 5% threshold, effect on math or reading test scores. But then they found in an experimental lab setting that the lottery winners who got access to the private school choice program were much more likely, or they donated higher amounts in a lab setting. I think it was about a 20 to 25% increase in charitable giving, even though there was no effect on test scores, which is another indication that if we regulate school choice based on test scores, you might miss out all of these other types of outcomes, such as charitable giving, and in the previous result, educational attainment, keeping kids in the system for longer, which is measured by educational attainment. There's other studies in here, which Patrick will go over in his presentation. But let's continue to the effects of school choice on crime reduction. There are only 6 studies that link school choice in terms of charter school choice or residential school choice or through a private school choice program, linking that to crime reduction. All 6 of these are peer-reviewed publications, and all of them find at least one statistically significant reduction in criminal activity. For example, Dobby and Fryer, the second row here, found people who won the lottery, a high-risk group of male students, were 100% less likely to be incarcerated of a crime. The lottery winners, none of them were incarcerated of a crime. Those who lost the lottery, about 4.4% of the males in the sample were incarcerated. And they also found in this same study that the female students were about 59% less likely to report a teenage pregnancy, which is another non-academic outcome of choice that we've seen in a couple of other studies as well. Another disconnect that I see in this table here is the David Deming study. He found that lottery winners of open enrollment choice in Charlotte, North Carolina, were significantly less likely to commit crime for a high-risk group of male students, but I don't believe he found any substantial effects on test scores. Again, the test score effects aren't showing the full picture of the benefits of school choice, which shouldn't surprise anybody, because when you ask families what they care a lot more about safety and the culture of the school, and they rank things like standardized test scores towards the bottom of the list. Let's go to this last table. What happens to the kids left behind in the traditional public schools? That's one of the biggest myths in the school choice debate, that school choice harms kids who are quote unquote left behind in the public schools, covered by Matt Ladner in this co-edited volume, but by myself and Neil McCluskey. Most of these studies find statistically significant benefits for the children who are quote unquote left behind in the traditional public school system. EdChoice has also summarized these data. A University of Texas at Austin research team published a study on this as well in 2019 in Educational Policy, a meta-analysis finding that in particular private school choice initiatives tend to be associated with improvements in the traditional public school system. I think there are about 26 of 28 studies find statistically significant positive effects. The latest one was in Florida, that first row, Figlio, Hart, and Carbonic 2020 study in NBER. They also found academic positive effects of the competitive pressures from private schools, positive effects on academic outcomes, but also on behavioral outcomes in the traditional public schools as well. So in this sense, school choice is a rising tide that lifts all boats, because the public schools start to scratch their heads a little bit and start to realize that if they don't change their game and do a better job, they might lose some of their customers to their competition. So they start to change their spending patterns, their curriculums. And in fact, this is what I found in a Brown University working paper with Christian Bernard from Reason Foundation. We randomly assigned competition to public school leaders in Texas, and we found that they started to allocate fewer resources towards support staff and administration, particularly when it came to public school leaders that had more experience. So this tends to suggest that competition is changing the spending patterns in the schools, which could lead to better outcomes in the traditional public schools. But I would even argue that this argument here, that the children who are quote unquote left behind in the traditional public school system, that should not be a legitimate reason to take away the choices of low-income families to choose the schools that work best for their children. We see that the evidence tends to be positive. I'm going to exit out of this for a second because I'm done with the studies. Can you hear me? I'm back. But even if the evidence was negative when it came to the competitive effects, that's not keeping advantaged families from choosing schools for their children. There's a financial effect on the public school district when advantaged families pay out of pocket to send their children to private schools. There's competitive pressures on public schools to change whenever advantaged families are switching sectors or switching locations. And none of these arguments are ever used to prevent them from having choices for their children. And although I go over a lot of these studies and this evidence, and a lot of us on this panel are talking about this today, I don't think that the right of families to choose the schools that work best for their children should hinge on, one, the competitive response of a government-run school system, and then also what academics say about what the evidence says. That low-income families shouldn't have to go begging to academics who are represented in these tables, which isn't a lot of people, and to ask them whether they should be able to choose a private school for their children when there are already advantaged families who get to do that. We don't do this when it comes to the traditional public schools. We don't say, oh, well, there's a positive study of school choice, which essentially says that having people choose the traditional public schools is a worse outcome. We don't tell them that we're going to take away the funding from the traditional public schools because of that type of outcome. We don't do this with food stamps, for example. We don't do a random assignment evaluation to see whether food stamps lead to better long-term outcomes and then take away people's taxpayer-funded initiatives through that. We don't do this with Pell Grants either. So I don't think we should do the same thing when it comes to K through 12 education in terms of private school vouchers, particularly when we don't bring that same energy to the traditional public school system. It's only applied to one sector, not the other. And it only becomes a big issue when low-income families are getting the opportunity to pick a school that works best for their child. And then there's more technical issues with using studies to determine whether families should be able to choose their schools. There's a lot of external validity issues, for example. Let's say you find a negative experimental evaluation finding negative effects in Louisiana, for example. Does that mean that families in California who are perhaps Maybe they'll get a voucher program at one point. Does that mean that they shouldn't be able to choose because there were other families in Louisiana who may have made the quote unquote wrong choice when given the option? Does this mean that does the negative Louisiana study mean that we should take away the right of families in Louisiana to choose the schools for their children? I don't think so. And then things change over time, right? A study could come out in 2010 that found negative effects on X, Y, or Z, and then maybe the schools could have gotten better over time. And so we have a lot of these problems when it comes to trying to centrally plan the decisions of thousands and thousands of families. I don't think that people like me and other academics have enough on the ground information about the needs of individual families making those choices. I think we can learn from the evidence, absolutely. And I think we should arm families with the results of the studies and to help them make better decisions. But at the end of the day, we don't have the tools at our disposal to be able to make choices for families better than they can for their own children. And so I think that's the main takeaway I want to get to here when it comes to these types of problems. And then one other problem is that these studies typically rely on groups and average outcomes, and no individual family is the average. It could be that some families make a decision that's not a good decision for their individual family setup, but they should be able to adjust their decisions based on what the results that they're seeing for their own children. And then, yes, with the averages, we don't know which particular families are making the good, quote unquote, good or bad decisions. So it's a central planning disaster that I don't think can be solved with the academics. Although I do think that we can learn from the studies that exist on the topic. And the main takeaway here as well is that, well, all of this aside, the evidence tends to be positive in favor of school choice, particularly when we're looking at the outcomes that families care most about. And with that, I'll pass it over to Pat Wolf.
Great, thank you, Corey. And before handing it over to Pat, great presentation. If anybody's looking for Christmas presents, you just gave a great overview of lots of books people can order. So order those books. And I'm surprised Corey made our panel, considering he was just named to Forbes 30 Under 30 and is quite a rock star now. So thank you for joining us. Speaking of rock stars, I will now hand it over to Pat Wolf.
Well, thank you, Lindsey. I'm the graybeard on this panel. And when you realize that I was on the doctoral dissertation committees of everybody else on the panel except Jude, you understand why. Actually, I am tremendously proud of the many young scholars I have had the privilege to teach and tutor and mentor over the years, and it's wonderful to see the great work that they do and the highly effective way that they present that work to others. So let me pull this up. I'm going to do a deep dive on two of the studies that Corey highlighted in his presentation that reflect on the longer term outcomes of attainment and character that might be influenced by private school choice programs. So how do we advance? Oh, okay, I think I got it here. All right, there we go. And okay, so attainment versus achievement. So Corey hinted at this. For the longest time, we evaluated school choice programs exclusively based on their effects on test scores. Attainment is a very important outcome, though. It's a measure of how far you go in education. And it's punctuated by key events like high school graduation, college enrollment, college completion. And it's driven by non-cognitive character traits. So those are the main things that are determining how far people go in education. For example, Corey, Mike, and Lindsey going all the way through to getting doctoral degrees in spite of the work that I did on their committees. Achievement, just as attainment is a measure of how far you go, achievement is a measure of how much you know. And it's driven by native intelligence and exposure to content. So we ideally want schools to influence both of those, both the character traits that drive attainment and the instruction and learning that drives achievement. But there could be situations where certain types of schools are better at one than at the other. And as Corey mentioned, Mike McShane, Colin Hitt, and I did a review of the evidence on this question, and we found that in all the studies of school choice effects, short-term achievement effects and long-term attainment effects, that the short-term reading impacts only weakly predict the attainment outcomes of these programs. And the math impacts actually negatively predict the attainment outcomes. That means the higher the math impacts of a school choice program, the lower the attainment effects that it will eventually have. And conversely, the lower the early math impacts that a choice program has, the higher the attainment effects that it has. So let's take a look at the Milwaukee Parental Choice Program. So most of you are familiar with this program. Many of you in the audience are extremely familiar with this program. It was the first modern school choice program, private school choice program, launched in 1990. So this is its 30th anniversary. It's a means-tested tuition voucher program worth about $6,400 during our evaluation period, which is about half of the per pupil expenditures in Milwaukee public schools. So this is a chart that maps the levels of private school participation in the MPCP over time and student participation in the MPCP over time. So the blue line is schools, the orange line is students, and you see something very important happened in 1998. Up until that point, the MPCP had been restricted to secular private schools. Religious private schools were not allowed to participate. But the Wisconsin Supreme Court, in a ruling that presaged the recent Espinoza v. Montana SCOTUS ruling, the Wisconsin Supreme Court ruled that that religious schools could not be excluded from the Milwaukee Parental Choice Program. Once religious schools were allowed in, a lot more schools participated. That blue line shot up. A lot more students participated because there was a greater number and diversity of schools available for parents to choose. And you see from that point on, the MPCP has surged in student enrollments, all the way up to just shy of 30,000 students by the end of 2018. Now, we started our study. It's the second major longitudinal evaluation of the MPCP. We started it in 2006 at this point, when the MPCP enrollments were growing. It ended in 2011. In terms of initial data collection and our assessment of test score effects of the program. But then we were able to extend it and look at some longer term adult outcomes of the program, especially after the youngest cohort in our study, third graders, graduated from high school in 2017. And this was just the second private school choice evaluation that was able to look at outcomes of choice on participants after high school graduation. What we did was we took a representative sample of a little over 2,700 of the participants in the MPCP, and we matched them to a set of 2,700 Milwaukee public school students. It's a very careful match. We matched on initial test scores. We matched on grade, gender, race. We matched on neighborhood. So these kids were even living in the same neighborhood. Some had access to the private school choice program, others attended Milwaukee public schools, and so really carefully match them on similar students. We drew our attainment data from the National Clearinghouse of College Enrollments in December of 2018, and we drew our crime and paternity suit data from the Wisconsin Court System's Circuit Court Access website in 2019. Anyone can search that database for records of people accused of crimes and convicted of crimes in the state of Wisconsin. So the bottom line is, if you're going to commit a crime, don't do it in Wisconsin, because everybody's going to know about it. So first, let's look at our attainment sample. I'm going to focus our results for our third through eighth grade sample. We also had a ninth grade sample that was smaller. The results for the third through eighth grade sample were very similar to the ninth grade sample, but more precise because we had more evidence behind it, bigger sample. We had 3,852 students who were in this attainment sample. They had at least 2 years past the time that they graduated from high school. So the younger kids, the youngest cohort, that third grade cohort, was 2 years past high school graduation. The oldest one, the eighth grade cohort, was, what would that be, 7 years past high school graduation. And we estimate the effect of the program, of participating in the Milwaukee Parental Choice Program, on 2-year and 4-year college enrollment and completion rates. So here are the results for enrollment. We see that the far left bars show the rates of ever enrolling in higher education. The dark bar is for the MPCP students. The light bar is for the MPS students. So the choice students enrolled in higher education at a rate that was 5 percentile points higher than their carefully matched peers. That's a statistically significant difference. When we look at the 2-year college enrollment, there's a slight advantage for MPCP students that is not statistically significant. So that might just be due to random noise. But we really see clear evidence in terms of the percentage who ever enrolled in a 4-year college. 30% of the low-income inner-city Milwaukee kids in this study who participated in the choice program enrolled in a 4-year college, compared to just 26% of their public school peers. But enrollment's one thing. Actually getting a degree, that's the real prize. And when we look at 2-year college graduation, very small percentages of both groups that are equal. 3% of MPS students, 3% of MPCP students. But when we look at graduating from 4-year college, the school choice kids graduated, 11% of them obtained a bachelor's degree within the course of our study, which was a statistically significant advantage of 3 percentage points over the rate of their MPS peers. All right, so we think that character development within the private schools chosen by these parents were largely responsible for this college graduation advantage we see in our Milwaukee Parental Choice Program kids. So let's look at other outcome measures of character to see if they also show an advantage for the choice kids. And here we are looking at the 8th and 9th grade cohort of students in our study who were in those grades in 2006. That's a total of almost 2,200 students, half of them MPCP students, half MPS. And what we did was we searched that database, that publicly available database, for any convictions for crimes that they'd had since they became adults. Once you're 18, you get put into that system if you are accused or convicted of a crime. And also, and this was Corey DeAngelis' big find, was he found that paternity suit data were in that database as well. So we could look at another outcome measure that's character related, basically how responsible these young people were in handling their sexuality and basically limiting the creation of children to the bonds of marriage. And these students, these young people were all aged 25 to 28 when we looked at these data in 2019. And that means, you know, basically from 18 to 28, those are peak years for young people to commit crimes or create children out of wedlock. So it gave us an opportunity to look and see if the choice students were doing those things at lower rates. So here are the big findings. We found that in terms of property damage crimes, only 1% of our sample committed any property damage crimes, but the participating in the MPCP almost completely eliminated the probability of someone committing a property damage crime. It reduced it by 86%. 11% of the students in our sample committed drug-related crimes, but if you had attended a private school in the choice program, your likelihood of being convicted of a drug-related crime was cut in half. And regarding paternity suits, we found that, again, about 11% of the students in our sample were subjects to a paternity suit, which means a baby was born, there was disputes about its parentage because it was outside of wedlock. That rate was 38% lower for students who participated in the choice program. Another way to think about this is that the MPS students in our study had a higher rate of creating a baby out of wedlock than graduating from a four-year college, whereas the choice students in our study had a higher rate of getting a bachelor's degree than creating a child out of wedlock. So that's two paths diverting radically in terms of future life outcomes. So in conclusion, our 3rd through 8th grade MPCP students in 2006 were 15% more likely to enroll in a four-year college and 37% more likely to attain a bachelor's degree. The 8th through 9th grade students in our study were dramatically less likely to be convicted of property or drug crimes and significantly less likely to be a party to a paternity suit. Now, we want to encourage more research. I want to echo what Corey said. We need to study these kinds of long-term outcomes of school choice programs more consistently, more rigorously, because that is a huge payoff for parents who have taken advantage of the opportunity to choose a private school for their child. And finally, go Hogs, win the borderline battle with those mean people in Missouri, like Mike McShane. You can find tons of research by Corey and Mike and other members of my research team, current and former students, at my research website that's listed there, scdp.uark.edu. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Patrick. That was fascinating. And the paternity suit reduction impacts are particularly fascinating as we think about all of the other positive benefits of education choice that go beyond test scores. A lot of the work I know that Brad Wilcox and others are thinking about as well. So it's really fascinating and very good for everybody to know about committing crime in Wisconsin. We'll make sure not to host the EdPalooza conference there in person in the future, just to be safe. But now I would like to hand it over to my colleague, Jude Schwalbach, to take us home on the education choice literature as it pertains to student safety.
You bet, Lindsay. Thank you. And let me pull up my PowerPoint here. Let's see. All right. Thank you, everyone. Like Lindsay said, I'm Jude Schwalbach from the Heritage Foundation. And earlier this year, Corey DeAngelis and I published a paper titled School Sector and School Safety, where we reviewed the literature surrounding safety in charter schools and private schools. And it wasn't just safety, it was perceptions of safety by principals, by parents, and by students. And as Corey alluded to earlier, safety is an increasingly popular factor in school selection for parents. some recent studies, Lindsey's with Jason Bedrick's survey, they found that school safety was in the top 3 reasons for why parents elected to choose a particular school. Other surveys have indicated that it was either very influential or even the second most influential reason for why parents chose a particular school. And so in our review of the literature, we found 9 studies looking at perceptions of safety in charter schools, and then 11 studies looking at perceptions of safety in private schools. And just to sort of discuss a little bit about how we decided which studies to include, we only included quantitative studies using experimental or quasi-experimental designs like RCTs, instrumental variable regression and matching methodologies. But the main thing is that the study need to include estimates of the effects of private or charter schools on student, parent, or principal perceptions of school safety or climate. So if I'll go to our first slide here, this is our table of the studies that pertain to charter school safety. And if we look at the first 2 studies, Gleason et al. And Tuttle et al., both RCTs, so quite rigorous, and both looking at parent perceptions of charter school safety. The first one found that parents didn't perceive a difference between charter school safety and the district school safety in district schools, but Tuttle et al. Did indicate that parents perceived charter schools as safer. Granted, it's worth mentioning that Tuttle et al. Is a KIPP commission study, but nonetheless, the parents in various states perceived charter schools as safer. The next 2 studies, Barrett and Hamlin, are from the perspective of students, and students indicated that they perceived their charter schools as safer than the district schools. A thing worth mentioning about Hamlin is that Hamlin said that those the safety advantages perceived by this perceived safety advantages perceived by students in the charter schools in Detroit, they only lasted for students that were attending a neighborhood charter school. And he defines a neighborhood charter school as for elementary students as a school that's 2.5 miles away from their residence, or for secondary students, a school that's within 3.5 miles of their residence. Students that attended charter schools further away than that, they didn't see the safety results weren't as advantageous for them. But if you were in that radius, charter schools were perceived as much safer by students. And then we have 5 studies looking at principal perceptions of safety in charter schools. Hamlin and Lee, DeAngelis, A and B, DeAngelis and Lucan, and Shaquille and DeAngelis. You can see Corey works on this quite a bit. But the main thing here is that, for example, in Shaquille and DeAngelis, charter school principals were just more likely to report events such as fights, gang activity, physical attacks on teachers as never occurring in their schools. In DeAngelis and Lucan, charter school principals reported that that things like physical abuse of teachers were just 28 percentage points less likely to occur in their schools. And then in Hamlin and Lee, we see that, which looked at nationally representative data from 2004 to 2016, it indicated that fewer instances of crime occurred at charter schools than district schools. So in sum, we have 9 studies that looked at charter school perceptions of safety in charter schools, 8 of which found positive perceptions, and the 1 outlier indicated null results. So moving on to perceptions of safety in private schools, the first 2 studies, Weber et al. And Wolf et al., are both looking at the DC Opportunity Scholarship Program, which is a voucher for low-income students living in the nation's capital. And what we see here is that in the most recent one, parents perceived no difference between charter schools, private schools and the district schools, and no difference in safety, whereas their children seem to disagree with them, and the students saw a notable safety advantage in the private schools rather than the district schools. The results were flipped actually almost 10 years ago in the Wolf et al. Study, where the parents perceived that private schools offered greater safety advantages, whereas the students didn't see a difference. There are 3 other studies, Howell and Peterson, Witt et al., and Diehaus et al., looking at DC, New York, and Dayton, Milwaukee, and Florida, looking at parent perceptions of school safety. And those were all positive as well. And then there are 4 studies, Fan et al., Farina, Laras, and Wasdorp, looking at student perceptions of safety in private schools. And those are also all positive. Lastly, we have the 2 remaining studies, DeAngelis and Lucan, Shaquille and DeAngelis, looking at principal perceptions of private school safety. And those are also all positive. And what this comes down to is that all 11 of the studies indicate positive perceptions of safety in private schools. Only in 2 instances where there are null results, but they are kind of offset in a sense by the student and parent perceptions in each respectively. Private school principals really reported some remarkable safety advantages in their private schools. For example, in Shaquille and DeAngelis, private school principals reported that events like fights were 8 percentage points less likely to occur in their schools. That things like having gangs were 18 percentage points, and having things like drugs were 12 percentage points less likely to occur in private schools. Similarly, in DeAngelis and Lucan, in the never occur responses, theft, possession of weapons on campus, and physical and verbal abuse of teachers were reported as being less likely to occur. So in sum here, again, it seems that charter schools and private schools are perceived as safer by parents, students, and principals overall. And another thing that's rather remarkable about this as well is that in the charter and private schools, in some instances, their safety restrictions are less strict, yet they still manage to report lower instances of crime or situations in which students feel unsafe. But with that, I'll turn it back over to Lindsey.
Great, thank you, Jude. Just more good news coming in on the school choice front. I would be curious if some of Mike's panelists or respondents to his survey sat through this presentation, if we would see even greater support for school choice after hearing all of this good news. So thanks to everyone. We do have a few questions that have come in. We only have about 3 minutes left. Everybody hit your time perfectly, so great work on that. Oscar, a quick question that came in about the replication potential for some of these studies, particularly on the school safety findings and some of the crime reduction components that are out there. Policy has been changing back and forth over the past few years on how schools deal with school safety. We're seeing things like restorative justice in some instances as an approach to school safety. So, is there the potential down the road to reassess how students, parents, principals are thinking about school safety, what impacts that might have on crime reduction? What does that look like moving forward? Whoever wants to take that, I don't know, Patrick or Jude or Corey.
I can jump in. The big challenge with that kind of replication, I agree with Inez that it's really interesting. It would be really interesting to see those trends. We can see them in the aggregate, but in an individual longitudinal study, usually you have to destroy all of your data with personal signifiers in it after a certain amount of time. And for example, the Milwaukee study, we're done with that. The time has run out on that, and some of these other studies too. Certainly the DC studies, we had to destroy data after our study. So it can be difficult to do like a long-term trend analysis with a panel of the same students. What you can get is a sense over time for aggregate levels of students, you can get a sense of whether behavior is degrading or improving in different types of schools, in part based on the kind of behavioral policies that they adopt. As I put in the chat, Phil Gleason of Mathematica did a great chapter in my edited book, School Choice: Separating Fact from Fiction, and he identified strict behavioral programs that include both carrots and sticks as part of the secret sauce for public charter schools to be successful. So, that suggests if you don't establish behavioral standards and order and discipline in your school environment, you're not going to get any of the payoffs from school choice.
Well said. And I guess just to wrap up here, and Mike, maybe you want to take this, but you mentioned that 38% of respondents in your survey are more favorable to homeschooling. I found that a little bit surprising, actually, considering how many families were just thrown into this after the pandemic hit, all became accidental homeschoolers, maybe had poor experiences with the district-provided crisis online learning. Any thoughts on the homeschooling component and what that means moving forward?
Yeah, I think a lot of that debate was skewed by a small number of very loud people on social media, who were talking about how terrible everything was, whereas a lot of the people that were succeeding were just doing it quietly by themselves, so they weren't like sharing a bunch of stuff about it. So I would be, the beauty of doing these types of things is that they separate out maybe the loudest voices from what the totality of people actually think about it.
So this is like the Yelp reviewing a restaurant phenomenon, right? Where you only get the people leaving bad reviews of the restaurants. Great. Well, Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Corey. Thank you, Patrick and Jude. Thank you all for joining us today. Really appreciate it and look forward to seeing you at future sessions. Thanks, everyone.